I'm really delighted to be part of this today. You know, news organizations talk a lot about transparency, trying to show readers and listeners and viewers how we as journalists actually do our jobs. Some of that is driven just by the live nature of news. You know, that the audience is learning about things as we are trying to tell them about them. Audience too, though, given the variety of sources of news, expect more. They want to know more about how we gather information and what the experience is like on the ground, because they want to be more discerning, if you like, about the news choices that they make. This documentary, though, is revealing in a way that news organizations and journalists themselves rarely speak about. It's not only a very compelling film, it's important for all of us. The journalists you'll hear in this film are brave. They go to places most of us would never dare to go, to cover wars and conflict. As is often said, they run toward danger. I also would say that it's far more brave to reveal their personal vulnerabilities as they do in this film, to talk about their work, the work they feel so compelled to do, and how it has affected them so profoundly. I know you won't be able to hear a pin drop in this room as you watch it. To talk about it afterwards, two of the key contributors, producers of the film, will be joining me on the stage. Dr. Anthony Feinstein, who's sitting in the front row here, is the leading medical professional on this subject. He's a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto and an associate scientist at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre. He's also a Guggenheim Fellow and the author of several books related to this. The most recent is Battle Scarred, which was published in 2011. And Martin Burke is a well-known and widely respected writer, director, and the author of 6 novels. For television, he wrote the adaptation of Orwell's Animal Farm and the comedy feature Top Secret. He directed also The Pirates of Silicon Valley, for which he received Emmy, Writers Guild, and Directors Guild Award nominations. And of course, Under Fire, Journalists in Combat, the film you're about to see. There is one guest who could not be here today, but you are going to see her in a film clip. I spoke to my colleague Susan Ormiston a few days ago. She's in the film and she was going to be part of this panel, but if you've been watching the CBC or listening to it at all, you'll know that she's actually on assignment in Russia, about to go to Siberia. Susan has reported from Ukraine, Afghanistan, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and South Africa. She's won 3 Gemini Awards for her work, one in particular for her reporting in Afghanistan. In 2011, Susan was awarded a Foreign Press Award for her work as the CBC's foreign correspondent based out of London. So you will hear from all of those people after the film. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you both. So I introduced our guests earlier, but just so you probably recognize them from the film, Dr. Feinstein on the end and Martin in the middle here. I've now watched this a few times, and it is as compelling every time. We used to sort of joke amongst ourselves when we were doing interviews in the news business, but there's nothing quite like the power of words and pictures and in their simplicity somehow. But I'm curious to know, first of all, and maybe I'll put this to you first, Martin, what drew you to this subject?
Well, I started off here in Toronto at CBC Current Affairs, and I would go to conflicts, but I was never in that world. I would go off and do other things as well. One year we were merged with the news department, and it was a totally different culture. And there are a lot of guys in the news department who had done a lot of covered a lot of wars. And in those days, it was almost exclusively male. Now it's changed a lot, as we'll see soon with Susan. But a lot of these people were strange, and they were different from what I'd known in current affairs. A lot of them had sworn they were going to write a novel. They had a half-finished novel in the drawer of their desk, and usually it was under a bottle of scotch. And they were a very strange breed, especially one guy whose nickname was Craze. And he had covered so many wars. The legend was that when he was in Vietnam, he would sometimes get so agitated he would jump up and run ahead of the troops. He was on, I don't know, 3rd or 4th marriage. He drank way too much. He had the very limited attention span. He was a great guy, but he was a very damaged human being. And he was an enormously talented guy, and he helped me a great deal, but I saw all of the symptoms that we've seen in the film in this guy, and I didn't know what they were. I mean, none of us did in those days. And of course, after I met Anthony, then they were kind of codified.
So tell me, I mean, I mentioned at the beginning, you clearly broke ground on what happens to journalists in combat. What triggered your particular interest?
I had a patient back in 1999 who came to my service at Sunnybrook. She had a very unusual presentation, and she turned out, after a detailed history taking and a number of investigations, we ruled out neurological causes for her symptoms, and it was a very extraordinary reaction to stress. It was a stress reaction, and she turned out to be a war journalist. So I was very intrigued by her presentation. I asked some of the members of my research team to go and do a literature search to say what's been published on this question of war and journalists and emotional responses, and we didn't find a single publication, not one thing. And that surprised me, because there's a huge literature on post-traumatic stress disorder. People have been victims of crime, soldiers, etc. But there wasn't a single publication on journalists. So we wrote a grant, and we sent it to the Freedom Forum in Washington, D.C., saying this is something we'd like to investigate, and they funded the study.
You're continuing to do research. I think you mentioned that you're doing research in Africa now. What have you learned about why some journalists are so drawn to this? We've heard them, talk like junkies, right?
Yeah.
What do we really know about this now?
I think, Paul Watson said it very well. There's something within the person's personality. They find this work exciting and interesting. They can't do a 9-to-5 job. There's a very clearly defined biology that pushes people towards more adventurous risk, more adventurous
biology,
lifestyle.
so like something chemical.
Very much so, yeah. And that's to a significant degree controlled by genes. We're all the product of our genes. And so there's certain individuals who are hardwired, who are able to do this work, are attracted to this kind of work. They don't want to sit in an office from 9 o'clock till 5 with an hour in a lunch break and a half an hour for tea. They just want something different. And then they've got a certain skill with a camera, or they're very good writers, and like history. And so there's a confluence of factors that comes together, and they find themselves as frontline journalists.
After you talk to all of these journalists, Martin, as a fellow journalist and as a filmmaker, what did you see in each of them?
Well, one thing that I found, just to pick up on what Anthony said, was the first time I was ever in a war, there was something strange that happened. I realized just getting through one more day gave you a sense of purpose, a strange sense of purpose. And every morning you got up and your purpose was to get through that day, whether or not you articulated in that way. And it was kind of strangely exhilarating. And I would see people, there were contractors who would go, like construction people, who went over to war zones just because they had the same sort of thing. And it's what you don't experience here. If you grow up here and you get up, as I did out in actually Etobicoke, where I grew up, I didn't feel that sense of purpose every day, And it becomes very seductive. And what I found was that the people who I interviewed, some of them can't escape, and some of them have since this film. For instance, John Steele, who was all through the film, John decided he was going to go off and write books, and he is now out of this world. He claims he is, and I think he is. Finbar O'Reilly is trying to extricate himself from this life, but some of them, like Anthony Lloyd from the Times of London, who was the guy talking about the hallucinations, but it wasn't really hallucinations of the dead bodies on the table in the south of France and all this thing, that he has gone back several times into Syria, and actually you sent me something that he was severely beaten. He was almost killed recently over there, and he seems like he can't escape it, So
it also occurred to me, because I've watched this film several times now, that it's almost reassuring to me that journalists have such a profound reaction to such horror. I mean, in some ways it would seem odd if you didn't.
Yeah. So, when we started the studies back in 1999, we studied, Bosnia. There was a tail end of Rwanda. We went on to look at journalists in Iraq, Afghanistan, Mexico. What we found is the overwhelming majority of journalists are resilient. So they're able to withstand these kinds of stresses and pressures. That doesn't mean that they don't get distressed from time to time, and some of them succumb to post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. These conditions are potentially treatable. So if you get treatment, you can recover and you can get back to doing this kind of thing. So I think to sustain this work, to be able to work in war zones for 15, 20 years, which is what these individuals have done, you've got to have that resilience, and they are.
However, I've seen a couple of cases out in combat of people that actually were hollowed out by it. There's one guy who is now dead. His name, I only knew his last name, Schneider. And he was the first off the helicopter, last in the helicopter. When you landed at the time you landed in a combat zone, he was always ahead of the troops, and he had to be pulled back by the troops when they were leaving. He was as dead a human being as could be at the time he was alive. All his emotions seemed cauterized. He was a strange individual. Now, whether he started off that way before he got there, I don't know, but whatever it was, he was somebody who had seen way too much combat, and he kept going until he was killed.
I mentioned earlier, Susan Ormiston was supposed to be here with us today. She's on assignment in Russia. I spoke to her about some of this a few days ago, and we've got a recording of the interview that we did. And so let's play that clip for you now, and then we'll pick up our conversation.
Susan, you said in the film that the hardest part about war coverage is before you go. Why?
Because that's when you're thinking about your choices. Going into war zones is not an easy choice. And you're at home thinking about, should you be going? What are the repercussions? How will your family manage while you're away? Will they worry? All those things. And I think everybody goes through it. Not everyone talks about it. Once you get on the plane, usually, you're into the story, and then it's full adrenaline, full go. But it's that gray zone in between where you question your interest and you question your choices.
Talk a bit about the adrenaline, because you and the other correspondents in the film talk about that. How there's a heightened awareness, that feeling of being on the edge. But John Steele also says you're never more alive than when you're staring death in the face.
Yeah, with reference to John Steele, I don't agree with him. That surely is his sincere opinion. I don't feel that. I've felt more alive doing many things, including having children. But for sure, the adrenaline is important. It's to get you through. But I think the most important thing, Alison, is that when you go into a conflict zone, the stakes are so high, clearly. It is a life and death struggle. And so you are on what I call the pointy end of the spear. And you're going in to look at change. You don't know, it's unpredictable, it's ferocious. People are living on the edge. And for a storyteller, people living on the edge is very intoxicating. So that's what the adrenaline is about. It's not, for me, about being a war junkie, about the guns and the conflict. It's about talking to people, even around the war zone, that are living in the most difficult days of their lives and trying to carve out a future. And it can change like that. That's the other thing about the adrenaline. It's so unpredictable. It does require you to be aware and have your antenna up all the time. You have to, for your own safety and the safety of those around you. So all those things combined is what is attractive to doing this kind of reporting. That, and it's usually a story that much of the world is focused on.
Talk a bit about your own coping mechanisms. When you talk about the adrenaline rush and the fear, and also worrying about, the people on your own team, what do you have sort of coping mechanisms yourself?
I think I operate with two rules. One is that we only go forward when everyone in the team wants to. And if one is expressing reservation, we have to stop, talk about it, and then make a decision. But you cannot lead the pack when other people are not comfortable. That's simply cannot happen. The other danger that a lot of people don't talk about is fatigue. because fatigue clouds your thinking, clouds your ability to see risks, to see opportunities, to get out of a dodgy situation. And fatigue is a real issue for all of us because these situations are intense. You're working, without a doubt, 18 hours a day. Your time zones are different. And so I remember one time in Syria making a choice not to go into the rebel-held territory, the southern suburbs, on a Sunday because I was simply too exhausted. And I felt on that day, I had been out before and would go again, but on that day I felt I'm not in any position to make a good decision if there's trouble.
What about your emotional coping mechanisms?
It's not a factor when you're in the moment. It is a factor when you get to the end of your rope, either while you're on assignment or at the end when you come home. Happily, I have not suffered from the real and present PTSD that's explored in this film, and others in the film have. It's probably much to do with just the time I spend in this situation, given times other people spend in it. So I have not suffered that. But you do have to monitor how you're feeling when you get home. And we are asked whether we're okay, whether we should see people. It's very, very important.
Have you ever done that?
No. No, I've never had to. Interestingly, one of the times when I felt more vulnerable was after a natural disaster, an earthquake, because it was the unpredictability of that, the ground moving underneath me that
Right.
I still held with me when I came back. But so in terms of coping, you know, it is really important, the themes that are described in this film, that you have to recognize it, you have to see it. And I think the real danger is getting addicted to it. And I think that's explored as well. The addiction is powerful, tempting, and ultimately can be very destructive.
You understand it.
I do. And
Do you
when
feel the tug?
Yes, I think I do. I mean, when any big story breaks that involves conflict, I want to be there. I'm restless.
I was going to say, because coming in, my question would have been, why do you still go?
I can't not go.
I wanted to ask you about re-entry, what it's like coming home.
It's like coming off a party or a project. Anyone who does project work understands. It's the intensity of the experience cannot be replicated, and your life fills, you've stepped in this sand and created this big footprint, and then the sand fills in when you come home with all your other responsibilities, children, dental appointments, demands at work, getting reconnected with your family. It's never easy. It's always a little bit awkward. It's difficult. I imagine it's like people who are in the military who come back after a deployment, and theirs is much longer. You have to work yourself back into the family and back into your life. And, you do have a mind still to the story as well, Alison. I mean, I think of the places I've been. For sure, every time I go somewhere that's newer to me, I end up getting so much experience and knowledge about that place that I keep thinking and watching and monitoring and following it when I get home. So I assemble these, countries and places and conflicts that I need to keep up on. But the appetite for reporting on them is not always there, so that's disappointing.
Some of the others talk about carrying, though. Paul Watson talks about carrying guilt. They obviously carry something that's more troubling in terms of the effect on them.
I've been able to compartmentalize experiences like that. The guilt associated with leaving, being able to go, being able to pick up and go. My job's done here now, and I can go back to my life. And that is a difficult emotion to feel, and people deal with it differently. So aside from that, I don't feel guilt in any way. I feel a passion to do the next series of stories on people. But again, my experience has been positive about the coping and the after effects of conflict reporting. For others, it hasn't been. I think a danger for many of us is that you get too entrenched in the game, in the lifestyle, in the desire to be there. And the more you do it, the more people expect you to perform miracles, which means take more risk. I often think about younger journalists who are freelancers, who are going to conflict zones to make their name, and feel worried for them because they don't have the protection and they don't have perhaps the ability to say no. I've always been able to say no, and I've never had any kind of pushback on that. And I think that's really important for people who are going into conflict zones, is to be able to say, this is my risk tolerance here, right here.
Interesting.
Listening to that again, and let me ask you, Dr. Feinstein, is there a way to know going in who may be more at risk for PTSD or some of the other kind of adverse reactions?
The simple answer is no. Yeah, very difficult to predict. I mean, if you've got a past history of emotional difficulties, in theory, that leaves you vulnerable. But to say in advance who's going to develop a condition like PTSD is very, very difficult. I mean, the military have been trying to crack this one for a century or more. Can they predict in advance of combat which soldiers will have that resilience? And there isn't an easy answer to that.
There was a guy that we were trying to get to who is quite famous correspondent, and he is well known for being absolutely even, and he goes through conflict after conflict after conflict, and he comes back home and seems even. And people are trying to figure out what it is about this guy, you know. Those are, in my experience, quite rare, though. I mean, most people are affected in one way or another.
Is there a difference in the way journalists see conflict and soldiers see conflict? Because those are the two, if we're talking about post-traumatic stress disorder here, I mean, we've learned most about it from, certainly in the general sense, from soldiers. But is there a difference in the way they see the conflict or experience it?
No, I think PTSD in a soldier will be the same in a journalist. It'll be the same symptoms, the same array of difficulties. I mean, the one thing is just, you know, culture can modify how you respond to trauma. So the way someone in Canada or America would respond to trauma might be different, say, to someone in a very different culture. So culture is a powerful modifier. But if you look at the core features of PTSD as described in veterans and in journalists, they're the same.
The nature of war has changed over the decades too. What's your sense, Martin, of how that's changed sort of the risks and what journalists confront when they're covering conflict like that?
I did a documentary once about the anniversary of the Normandy invasion with a bunch of old World War II veterans. And it was all, this was obviously not a scientific observation or anything, but I often wondered if they didn't have it easier in one way, in that after the war, they were all kept together over in Europe for often months at a time. It took a long time to get back to Canada, and they could talk things through amongst themselves over and over. In Vietnam, that was the first war where you could be in combat on a Tuesday in a jungle, and on Thursday you would be back home in Nebraska, and the switch was just too abrupt, too quick. And I've often wondered if there wasn't that kind of decompression which happened in earlier wars, which is missing from right now. You go from combat to at home to the family party, and they're all talking about mortgages and hockey and school and all that thing, and your mind's still way back over there. I often thought that would be a tougher way to how it is right now.
I also see too, though, and I think Finbar in the film referred to it at one point, you see him on location and he'd say it's mad here. I think he was in Libya.
Yeah.
You know, the rebels are running up and down the road, and you can't figure, there's no front line anymore, right? That the conflict is all around you. Is that reflected, Dr. Feinstein, in sort of how journalists are responding? Because there is no, it's not, war is not an orderly thing in the sense like it was in the Second World War, for example.
You know, one of the things that we've done is that the data that we've collected, we've used the same measures going all the way back. So for 15 years, we've got the same measures over time. And this month, we published a paper on journalists working in Syria. And for the very first time in all this data collection, we see a significant increase in the rates of depression in journalists working in Syria. So I think there's something about the nature of the conflict that's become even tougher for this group to deal with. There's no safe place. If you're not with the Syrian government, there is no safe place. There's no bureau at the end of the day to go to where you can take your flak jacket off. You're basically living amongst the people who are being attacked all the time. And that level of unremitting violence, the threat of kidnap is something that's new as well. You know, ISIS has put out a bounty on the heads of journalists, very large amounts of money. Fixers are turning in journalists. They're betraying their loyalties, and that's what happened to
Become-
Anthony
we've
Lloyd.
become targets now.
Exactly,
Yeah.
in a way that I think is unprecedented in the history of journalism. And it's, from a behavioural point of view, you're now starting to see this show up in the scores that we collect, and the depression rates have gone up.
That was one of the things, too, in the war in Vietnam. If you were in the press over there, you were told to yell Bao Chi, which means reporter. And if you were in combat and you were in trouble, yell Bao Chi and you'd be okay. Now you do that, if you yell reporter, then you're the target. Big difference.
Well, and I know too, there have been stories about, in their Jeeps, the journalists used to put press right on the top of the Jeep so that
Yeah.
you wouldn't be a target. Well, now
Yeah.
certainly now the combatants often put press on the top of their Jeeps, but also it means that you can in fact be a target as well. Talk a little bit, both of you, about, and it's been touched on a bit in the film, it's almost like this unique belief system that conflict correspondents have. That somehow, you either have to accept that you're going to be okay or that you're not going to be okay, that there's something you have to have kind of a philosophical approach to it.
There's a title to a biography on Martha Gellhorn that says, "Nothing ever happens to the brave." And I think that just kind of sums it up, this belief that nothing is going to happen to brave people. Of course, it's false. Terrible things happen to brave people. But I think it's a way of thinking about yourself. And I think journalists certainly embraced that for a long time, that just because you were a journalist, you had a certain immunity, that you could go into combat. You're not a combatant, so people will leave you alone and you can do your work. But things, of course, are fundamentally different now.
I think Anthony Lloyd says it best because he says it's about the odds, and he does this calculation in his head. And it's like a lot of things in life, you think you're going to get through, and I've seen most of the journalists that I've seen had this kind of feeling. But now, of course, there is more worry in the part of the journalistic corps, but I always experienced in the old days, somehow we would get through.
And I think somehow if you don't have that belief, you can't do this.
That's what you say in the film. Yeah, you have to think that. Although sometimes reality does intrude, and you think, "Wow, I'm pushing my luck." And some of these guys in this film have come to that conclusion now.
I was going to say, is it an age-related thing?
I'm sure there's a lot to do with men, with the testosterone levels and other things which you can talk more about than I can. But no, I'm sure that's a part of it. And also, too, just one thing, too, which she was saying just now, and about the young journalists going off. Everybody talks about Vice now, this new organization that's doing all this kind of gung-ho journalism. I take a different view a little bit because it's been there forever and ever. In Vietnam, nobody remembers Sean Flynn. Sean Flynn was the son of Errol Flynn. And he and a guy named Dana Stone were two 20-somethings who were like a lot of 20-somethings over there, and they pushed the envelope all over the place. They took more risks than all the NBC or the CBS correspondents. They would do crazy things. And they went into Cambodia and have never been heard from since. They went in on the back of a motorcycle and vanished. They were murdered there, and they were the Vice of their day. And there will always be a Vice. Every generation will have its own kind of Vice organization, which will do crazier things than the established news organizations do.
There's a very strong correlation between age and risk.
Just generally.
Absolutely. As you get older, you're less likely to take risk. It's very well described. Yeah. That's why this is a young person's profession for the most part.
Right. And what about male-female?
Well, that's also fascinating because men are linked to risk more than women because of a different biology. But when we look at our data in terms of gender and emotional response in war journalists, we don't see a gender difference. That we see the similar rates of anxiety and depression and PTSD symptoms in the men and women. And if you go out into the general population, you see something fundamentally different, that the rates in women are twice what they are in men, consistently. It's a well-replicated finding in general psychiatry. If you step into the journalist, the frontline journalist, you do not see this gender difference. And in fact, the military reports similar data in terms of their soldiers who've come back from Afghanistan and Iraq, that there isn't the strong gender divide in terms of emotional response.
And is there any explanation as to why that is?
I think there is. I think that the women who do this are a very select bunch. They're not your typical woman. There's a self-selection process over here, and the ones who do it have that same kind of drive that the men have to do this kind of work, and by extension, a certain resilience to the emotional consequences of this.
I did find one difference, though, which I asked that question of Christina Lamb,
Right.
which she did not like, and that occasionally in the audience people have tried to nail me for that, but I found no guy I talked to, no male, ever talked about, oh, I felt so guilty about leaving my little son or my little daughter. They will pay lip service to it, you know, but they just go there.
The wife and kids. Yeah.
But the women, you know, they would talk about this, and it was obviously on the
Well, Susan
forefront of
does
their mind.
too,
Yeah,
yes, yeah.
yeah, and that was right up front. And the men, oh yeah, I have a family back home. You know, it was usually that was they didn't have that kind of same ties or that tug back home.
The gender question is fascinating because there are certain women that we've studied who have no symptoms of PTSD or anxiety or depression, and then they have a kid. And in the aftermath of childbirth, we've got this period of vulnerability because of, you know, postpartum and the hormones are different. They start experiencing some profound symptoms of anxiety and mood. And then they wonder, what's going on? Why am I experiencing it now? Because I'm far away from the trauma, etc. So the biology plays a
So
very
even
important
if they
part.
don't go back into the war zone after they have children.
Well, in the immediate aftermath, you know, the vulnerable postpartum period when you're at risk,
Yes.
when women are at risk for mood change, during that period, suddenly there's an upsurge in symptoms that they'd never experienced before. And that's once again because the biology is different at that point.
Was it difficult to get journalists to talk about this?
Well, two things. One was that Anthony has a name in the profession, which was quite timely and quite valuable. And the other one was a lot of these people, when we approached them, it just was that moment where a whole profession seemed to decide, okay, we've kept it in for long enough and we haven't talked about this, it's time to talk about this. And it was a kind of a zeitgeist thing, you know, just across the profession. There were some people, the correspondent I talked about earlier who was even-keeled, he kept on, he was always going to do it tomorrow, and he would call me. I was in London, and he said, oh, I'm in Cairo, can you come to Cairo tomorrow? And then the next day he'd call me and say, oh, could you come to Libya? I mean, he did not want to talk about it. There was a famous woman who died, Marie Colvin,
Right.
who was an amazing woman. She had an eye patch. She was quite, I guess the overworked word, iconic in some ways. But she had told Anthony that she was going to do it, and then we couldn't find her, you know. But generally, people decided, okay, enough is enough. Let's talk about it.
And in the time since you've now started doing this research, how would you describe the shift in attitude about this now?
I think news organizations are now recognizing this is important, and they're now providing, you know, confidential counseling to journalists. So I think that's been a very big change. I think most organizations now do this. I think 15 years back they weren't doing it. So the data, the empirical data, I think have had an effect. Up until then it had always been anecdotal, someone's opinion, someone's experience, but now there's a substantial body of data saying this is actually important. But there's another side, which is this. I think you have to be careful about not overdoing this. You know, I think my concern is that if there's too much focus on trauma the whole time, some of the more experienced frontline journalists can start to resent it a bit. And that's my concern. There is a potential trauma industry, wanting to see trauma everywhere. And I think you have to be very careful in terms of how you collect your data, and you have to be very meticulous about the data because you don't want to overstate the problem. Yes, I mean, some journalists can, as Anthony Lloyd said, can be taken down very hard, but there's also a great resilience to this profession, and you have to be able to see that as well. You can't, just because you've gone off to war and seen terrible things and experienced terrible things, doesn't mean that you are traumatized. Susan Ormiston says it very well. And I think you've got to be able to see that balance. And so when you collect your data, you've got to do it very carefully.
Is there a way to prepare journalists before they go into conflict, before they go into war? I mean, at the CBC and other news organizations too, we're required, probably mostly for insurance purposes, I would think, to take what they call hostile environment training, and they enact scenarios where you're taken hostage and you're kidnapped, and you do all of those things. I'm not sure how much preparation that would actually give you for dealing with those kinds of situations?
I mean, I think education is very important. I mean, journalists need to know about what the psychological risks are, not just the physical risks, because I think if you're educated, you can be better prepared to deal with things, and you might be able to pick up your own difficulties much earlier on. Because what I noticed 15 years back when we started that there was a great naivete in the journalists, some of whom were suffering and they didn't know where it was coming from, what was happening to me. But I think once you've kind of explained the situation and explained what depression is, what PTSD is, they have a better understanding of what the risks are, and that's a big plus.
I started by actually paying my own way over to a war. I got a press card from a Toronto newspaper, and I had seen all the footage of the shelling in the war. I landed expecting to have to run for cover, and landed in an airport and everything was fine, and people were just going about their business. I thought, what is this? And the first few days I slept under a tin roof shack. It was the only place I could afford with a mud floor. And the reason I mention this is that I thought, well, this is silly, but this war is nothing. And then when it hit, when you find yourself in it, I found, and I didn't have this kind of training, obviously, I found nothing could have prepared me for it. I was scared stiff in a way that I had never been scared before. I mean, nothing could have prepared me for that. And the terror is very interesting, the effect it has on you, and you learn things about yourself when you have that terror, you know. And I don't think there's any training could have prepared me for it.
I would agree.
One of the other things that occurred to me, and as I was listening, I mean, some of those journalists are, and they admit themselves, they're kind of junkies. That John Steele was, wrecking the room to get out on the next war assignment. Somebody like Susan goes in for 2 or 3 weeks and then comes out, and then spends a period of time, covering other things, and then goes in. That's a different kind of experience, it seems to me, on the surface, right? That you may be less at risk for that kind of trauma if you're not inundated, if you're not living with that kind of stress and pressure all the time. Am I wrong?
I think so, but I also think that people's desire for risk lies along a continuum. They're going to be people, all human behavior lies along a continuum. And they're going to be people who want it much more than others, and they're going to be people who want it moderately so or less so. And they're going to be people who never want it, so they're never going to do that.
Right.
And you're going to see that kind of continuum in this group as well. They're going to be those who are there the whole time,
Right.
and those who choose more selectively what they want to do.
That's kind of the current affairs approach that I was talking about earlier, that you go on to other things,
Yes.
which I found very, very healthy. I think if all you do is cover wars, wow, that's not good.
All right, I'm going to open it up to some questions from you. We've got some microphones on either side, so if you raise your hand, we can find you and you can ask your questions.
Firstly, I'd just like to commend you on such a powerful film. It's very important. The question I have is, when you're dealing with individuals who have post-traumatic stress disorder or they dealt with it in the past and you're interviewing them, what precautions do you take to ensure that you don't trigger an anxiety attack or send them into like a state of relapse when you're trying to get them to recall what they were going through?
Well, obviously that happened in the film. And quite frankly, I wasn't prepared for that at all, obviously. I'm saying the obvious here. Paul Watson and I had talked on the phone. Paul had written a book where he talked about this, and he seemed, I'm going to use the word normal, that's the only word I can think of. I had no inkling that he was going to break down the way he did. John Steele was close to doing it, and yet had we not asked or gone into those areas, then we would not have had a film that would have been worth watching. So it's a very delicate balance, and good question. I'm not sure how you can do a film without in some way reliving parts of what these people would like to avoid, because that's what the film is about.
I thought it was a stroke of genius that you came back with paints for Ian to recreate that.
Yeah, I had talked to him. That interview was filmed at the University of Michigan, where he was a postdoctoral student or something. And he told me on the phone about how he kept on having all these traumas when he did the paintings and all that. I ran out to a place out in the beaches, grabbed the paint box and stuff, and you saw on the film where he wasn't sure he wanted to do it, and there was much more on the film about him not sure, you know. And then once he got into it, he really wanted to do it, you know. And afterwards, he said, "I'm so glad. I felt almost cathartic doing that, you know." So that was an interesting moment.
Question here?
Yes. There was one journalist who touched on a very difficult childhood, perhaps some child abuse by his dad. And I wondered, although these journalists are doing an incredible service to society and the globally, I wondered if there was some self-abuse kinds of or punishment, self-punishment component to their work.
I haven't come across that. I mean, I've certainly come across some journalists who had difficult childhoods. There's a very well-known BBC journalist by the name of Fergal Keane, and I would recommend you read some of Fergal's work because he's wonderfully articulate. And he's very open about the family that he grew up in because he had an alcoholic father. And he wrote about, you know, his continuation of war work was really his war work was a continuation of his home environment, which I think touches on what you've asked in your question. But I think, in my experience, I think that that level of dysfunction is unusual.
Didn't you, I recall a conversation we had and you mentioned that a number of the men had issues with their fathers, was it?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly journalists who have come from troubled upbringings. Some of them come from military families as well, but there are also, you know, great journalists who come from very stable middle-class families that, you know, have been very functional. So I'm very careful to not paint a picture that the whole profession's like this. But yes, within some of these journalists, you can go back and find a troubled upbringing. But I suspect that's probably true of much of big chunks of society as well.
I'm sure accountants have the same thing.
There's a question over here.
Yes, thanks. I also want to commend you on the film. I thought it was really excellent. But one of the things that I wondered about that wasn't discussed in the film, a number of the journalists said that they questioned why they were doing it. And now with new media and blogging from people who are in dire straits and are citizens of these countries and so on, does that compound the feeling of kind of, why am I doing this? Like, it's one thing when there is no knowledge in the rest of the world, and we were like that forever, but all of a sudden now, suddenly you'll get frontline reporting from someone who's just come in from the demonstration and has pictures.
I mean, that's a really excellent question. I don't know the answer to that. It's probably.
I would just say, as a journalist, you still feel like you have to verify. And yes, you have probably, if you're a television journalist, you have more information to draw on to tell your story, but you still feel like you have to verify. It's like Paul Watson saying, I had to go back out and you know, make sure that the truth was told. So that, yeah, go ahead.
I understand that, but I guess there was that first casualty of the First World War, right? And the co-option by the military, especially with embedded units. So I just keep wondering if we've come full circle.
Well, actually, I had an experience in the 1980s when the Soviets were in Afghanistan. I wanted to do a film about what was going on in there. I wanted to take a break from my life in Hollywood, and so I wanted to do a film to get into Afghanistan, and it was impossible. It was really difficult to get into Afghanistan. There was no social media then, obviously, and there was nobody there. And I was doing an interview in New York City with one of the NGOs, I think it was Médecins Sans Frontières, and one of the people there, one of the doctors, French doctors, said, we're in there because we are witnesses. Nobody knows what's going on. We're the only witnesses. I changed the title of the film to be Witnesses. I went inside Afghanistan myself. I got to the handful of people who were going inside, and they felt a real mission. I haven't seen that in the same way ever since. I mean, I agree with your point about journalists want to verify, And especially now, there is a variation on what the Russians did at the time of the Soviet Union. There was all this disinformation. And as we all know on the internet, it's not all true. I mean, the social media can be a ton of propaganda. And one of the journalists' jobs has changed a little bit, and that's to evaluate this massive information and to try and get to the truth. So it's changed in that sense, but there's not the sense of the world will never know unless we're there. That is, I think, probably gone,
Well,
largely.
I guess what had prompted this was I spent a lot of time in Northern Ireland during the 70s
Oh.
into the early 80s.
I think I saw you there. I was there.
And what you'll recall is that there was enormous censorship by the British government, certainly for any reporting in British media. The BBC had, their Section D. There were, it was against the law to take pictures of the soldiers or the police. You remember all of that?
Yeah, but I missed that because I did everything. The one area I was really afraid of was the IRA, and there was a funeral up in Derry, up in Londonderry, and I went with a little handheld camera, and we were very nervous because the IRA was very antagonistic toward us, and I never experienced such cooperation that I
Well,
ended up standing over the open grave, and they were telling me, get closer, get closer.
Because they needed the message to get out. I think that's something that journalists performed, in a stellar way, as you say, being a witness to killing in Afghanistan or Rwanda. I mean, there are lots of these you can think of, but I just wondered about the changes.
And actually something that Anthony deals with a lot more than I certainly do, obviously, but there are many places in the world where being a journalist, like for instance Russia or Mexico right now, which you've had experience, which you might want to talk about, where it's really dangerous if you tell the truth in these places. If you're in Mexico and you want to get close to the truth, God help you. It's a whole different thing than being over here. Anthony, you might want to.
Yeah, I think one of the offshoots of citizen journalism is that there are now big news organizations who have departments devoted to material coming from the man in the street. And so, people pull out a cell phone now and actually start filming some of the stuff, and it's really reaching news organizations in real time, live time. And then they have to process this huge amount of material that's coming in off the streets. So they actually have individuals set aside, they call it user-generated content or citizen journalism. And that by itself can pose challenges, because if your job is all day to sit in a darkened room looking at terrible images coming off the streets of certain countries, that can be a very difficult job for some people, and we've published on that too. Yeah.
Another question up here.
Yes, I believe in the film it was said that the photo that came to be known as Black Hawk Down caused a change in the American foreign policy. What was that change?
The Americans had been denying a lot of what was happening over there, and once that photo was published, the American public opinion turned against the whole enterprise over there, the military enterprise, and the Americans pulled out of that whole area. There was no more American presence over in Somalia, and that was the photo with massive revulsion all over America, and they were gone.
Up here.
Oh, hello. I thought that was an excellent
Oh
piece.
yes, go ahead. Yeah.
I thought that was an excellent piece of work. It was amazing and it was great insight into the real experiences of journalists. As a drama therapist myself, it was interesting to see the gentleman working with art materials in order to express the trauma that he'd seen and to tell his story. What, with regards to treatment, art therapy and drama therapy, in what way has that, or is that being used within PSD in Canada? Specifically with journalists.
I mean, I think there probably is a place for it. I mean, I'm not the most qualified to speak on that. There are other therapies that are provided more widely. Cognitive behavior therapy is used, prolonged exposure therapy is used. Some therapists use the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing to treat trauma. So there are a number of different ways of doing it. I would imagine that the art therapy has got a place within this milieu. I don't think it's going to be center stage with those kind of treatments, but I think it can be very helpful for people to express themselves. I mean, I'm probably preaching to the choir, you do this. But I cannot give you figures or numbers or where, how many people practice it.
Actually, there's a very interesting magazine out right now. The current edition of National Geographic has the photograph on the cover is of a U.S. Marine, a young U.S. Marine, holding up the paper mache mask he made of what he sees himself as being after he was blown up. I mean, he was okay physically, but he went through a terrible explosion, and it completely changed his mind and all sorts of things. And they go in this article on all of these usually male soldiers who experience incredible experiences in combat, and they made these masks, and they show all these masks, and they're very interesting. They're horrendous looking masks, some of them, and that's what they see themselves as being now. It's actually something you should get, or you should look at. Yeah.
One more question up here, and I think we're almost out of time.
Thank you. It's such a powerful film. Thank you so much for presenting it. I wanted to ask Dr. Feinstein if you can talk a little bit about what you think. You've been doing several studies. You've mentioned studies going back over 15 years now, I think. What you think the impact of the studies has been? I'm sure it's hard to say that in one or two lines, but just if you could comment on that. Thank you.
I think the early studies changed the culture by making treatment available to journalists. So, counseling and trauma support wasn't there 15 years back. So I think within Western news organizations there's been a shift. Much of the research that we're now focusing on are countries elsewhere, where I would estimate that this whole question is a decade or more behind. So, for example, we did a study in Mexico funded by UNESCO, and there the levels of trauma in the journalists covering the drug violence is extraordinary. Really is. And there wasn't a mechanism to help these journalists. So you go in and you collect the data, and then you present the data back to this community and saying, here's your empirical data, what can you do to try and change the situation? So that was a Mexican story. We've done the same thing now. We're in the process of doing the same thing in Kenya, trying to get a dialogue going in those countries where there's no familiarity with this. It's really not even entered the discourse of journalism. And the journalists are, of course, seeing terrible things. The Kenyan story is remarkable on so many levels. They have to cover the violence of Al-Shabaab. There was a Westgate Mall attack. There was this horrendous election violence where there was ethnic violence. And the journalists are in the middle of all of that. And there isn't a mechanism in place to try and help them. So you try and use this empirical data to convince news organizations that look beyond the anecdote, and this is what the situation is. So I hope that's where this is coming from.
And I can just add to that, with the guy I was talking about earlier, Craze, as his nickname was, I just wish that this had been there. He died a very lonely death, and he had every psychological problem you can name. And I just wish that this, what Anthony's doing, had been around.
Thank you both very much for the film and
Thank you.
for being here and for your commitment to all of this. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.